My mother finally broke 2 years of silence and said, "Your brother has no one else." I laughed and replied, "Try paying his debts with the inheritance you secretly took from me before you ask for my help." The glow of my phone screen lit up the dark corner of my porch on a warm Tuesday evening in late spring. I was sitting in a wooden rocking chair on the back deck of my home in Henrico County, Virginia, watching the last faint traces of orange light fade behind the oak trees. The caller identification showed an unblocked number that I had not seen on my screen in over 700 days. My thumb hovered over the screen for 3 full seconds before I slid the bar to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear without speaking, listening to the faint static of the line and the sound of shallow breathing on the other end. Her voice came through the speaker with a sharp, familiar urgency that immediately erased the 2 years of calm I had built for myself. She did not ask how I was doing, nor did she acknowledge the 24 months of bitter radio silence that had passed since our last explosive encounter. She simply stated that my younger brother Tyler was in catastrophic trouble with private lenders and state tax authorities, and that he had no one else left in the world to save him from ruined credit and potential legal charges. She demanded that I immediately liquidize my personal emergency savings to cover his $75,000 debt before the end of the calendar month. A quiet, bitter laugh escaped my throat before I could even stop it. I listened to her gasp in indignation across the line, outraged that I was treating her desperate plea with such casual dismissiveness. I spoke into the receiver slowly and clearly, telling her that she should try paying off Tyler's endless debts with the $140,000 of my grandfather's inheritance that she had secretly stolen from me before she ever dared to ask for my help again. Before she could launch into her usual routine of tearful deflection, gaslighting, or maternal guilt, I tapped the screen and ended the call. I set the phone face down on the wooden side table beside my chair and took a deep, steady breath of the humid evening air. My hands were completely still. There was no sudden rush of adrenaline, no racing pulse, and no wave of guilt washing over my conscience. 5 years ago, a phone call like that would have sent me into a tailspin of anxiety, self-doubt, and desperate attempts to keep the peace. 2 years ago, it would have filled me with explosive rage and a burning desire to force her to see the truth. On this night, however, it brought only a profound sense of clarity and a quiet confirmation that I had made the right choice when I walked away from her toxic orbit. To understand how a mother could steal 6 figures from her own son and then call him 2 years later demanding more money, you have to understand the dynamic that governed our household in Chesterfield County, Virginia, for as long as I can remember. My family was structured around a single, unspoken rule that everything had to be sacrificed to protect my younger brother Tyler from the consequences of his own choices. My father was a quiet, hardworking man who spent 30 years as an industrial mechanic at a manufacturing facility near the James River. He was a practical man who kept his head down, worked mandatory overtime shifts on weekends, and believed that keeping his mouth shut was the best way to maintain peace in his home. My mother was a completely different person. She was obsessed with appearances, social standing in our suburban neighborhood, and the constant projection of financial success that our middle-class reality could barely support. Tyler was born 2 years after me, and from the moment he could walk, my mother designated him as the brilliant, talented child who was destined for greatness. If Tyler struggled with his schoolwork, my mother marched into the principal's office to complain that the teachers were failing to accommodate his unique intellectual style. If Tyler got caught breaking minor laws or vandalizing property with neighborhood teenagers, my mother paid for the damages out of her grocery budget and insisted that he was simply being framed by jealous peers. I was expected to be the stable, self-sufficient anchor who required zero maintenance, zero financial support, and zero emotional investment. I was given chores, held to strict academic standards, and reminded daily that my duty as the older brother was to support Tyler and keep our family looking strong. My true sanctuary during those formative years was not our house, but a small brick workshop located 20 minutes away in rural Chesterfield County. That workshop belonged to my grandfather, Arthur Miller, who was my father's dad. Grandpa Arthur was a retired precision machinist and independent tool contractor who lived alone in a modest, immaculately kept brick ranch house built in the late 1950s. Behind his house stood a 500-square-foot workshop filled with heavy steel lathes, drill presses, drawers organized by thread pitch, and the rich, nostalgic smell of cutting oil and sawdust. Grandpa Arthur was a man of few words, but every word he spoke carried real weight. He saw through the performance my mother put on for the rest of the extended family. He saw how hard I worked in school, how I spent my summers working shifts at a local hardware store, and how my mother routinely brushed my achievements aside to celebrate Tyler simply passing to the next grade. Starting when I was 12 years old, I spent almost every Saturday at Grandpa Arthur's side in that workshop. He taught me how to measure tolerances with micrometers, how to change the oil and brakes on his old Ford pickup truck, and how to maintain meticulous financial records for small repair jobs. He would sit at his heavy oak desk in the corner of the shop, open his black ledger books, and show me how he tracked every single dollar that came in and went out. He told me repeatedly that a man's character is measured by two simple things: his willingness to do hard work when nobody is watching, and his absolute honesty when money is on the table. He loved both of his grandsons, but he was under no illusions about Tyler's character. Grandpa Arthur watched as Tyler grew into a teenager who refused to hold down a summer job, spent hours on internet forums obsessing over luxury street clothing, and constantly demanded expensive brand-name gear from our mother. Whenever Tyler visited the workshop, he would ask Grandpa Arthur how much his classic tools were worth, or how much money he made from selling off pieces of his surrounding acreage. Grandpa Arthur would slowly wipe his grease-stained hands on a red shop towel, look Tyler dead in the eye, and tell him that true value is built over decades of discipline, not found in quick schemes or handed out on silver platters. Tyler would usually roll his eyes, pull out his smartphone, and walk back out to the driveway to wait for my mother to pick him up. When I was 19 years old and midway through my sophomore year studying logistics and supply chain management at Virginia Tech, my father suffered a sudden, fatal heart attack at his workplace. The loss devastated our family, but it also completely removed the only quiet buffer that had kept my mother's worst impulses in check. With my father gone, my mother took complete control of the family finances, receiving a modest life insurance payout from his employer. Instead of using those funds to secure her own retirement or ensure her financial stability, she immediately began pouring money into Tyler's increasingly unrealistic lifestyle. Tyler was 18 at the time, had just barely managed to graduate from high school, and had decided that college was a waste of time for someone with his innate business genius. He convinced my mother to buy him a high-end computer setup and thousands of dollars in commercial inventory so he could start a limited edition sneaker reselling platform out of her garage. I was working 30 hours a week at a retail shipping store in Blacksburg to cover my own off-campus rent, groceries, and textbooks. Whenever I called home to check on my mother, she would spend 40 minutes gushing about Tyler's brilliant entrepreneurial vision, while completely forgetting to ask about my exams or my health. When Tyler's sneaker business collapsed 6 months later due to poor record-keeping, unpaid supplier fees, and his habit of keeping the most expensive inventory for his own personal wardrobe, my mother simply absorbed the 5-figure loss without holding him accountable. She told me that every great businessman experiences early setbacks, and that Tyler was simply learning valuable real-world lessons. Grandpa Arthur watched this downward spiral with deep, quiet concern. During my senior year at Virginia Tech, when my own savings were stretched dangerously thin, and I was worried about paying my final semester's tuition, Grandpa Arthur called me into his workshop office. He reached into his metal filing cabinet, pulled out a cashier's check made out directly to the university bursar's office, and handed it to me across his desk. When I tried to thank him and promised to pay him back as soon as I landed my first full-time corporate job, he placed his large, calloused hand over mine and stopped me. He told me that he was not giving me a loan, but rather investing in a young man who knew the value of an honest day's labor. He made me promise that I would finish my degree, build a career based on integrity, and never allow myself to be dragged down by people who preferred shortcuts to hard work. That was the last major conversation I had with my grandfather in his workshop. 8 months after my college graduation, while I was settling into my first entry-level supply chain analyst job in downtown Richmond, Grandpa Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. His death left an immense void in my heart, but the events that followed his funeral would slowly unearth a level of deception that I never could have imagined. Because my father had already passed away, my mother was the sole surviving adult in the primary family line when it came time to address Grandpa Arthur's affairs. Grandpa Arthur had hired a small-town estate attorney in Chesterfield County decades prior to handle his basic legal documents. A few weeks after the memorial service, my mother called me and Tyler to her house to discuss the estate. She sat us down at the dining room table, made a show of dabbing her eyes with a tissue, and explained that Grandpa Arthur's final months had been far more expensive than any of us realized. She claimed that his extended home health care, medical co-pays, prescription costs, and outstanding property taxes had completely wiped out his cash accounts. She told us that his modest ranch home and the workshop property had to be sold quickly to pay off those mounting medical bills and administrative expenses. She stated that after all the debts, estate fees, and legal bills were settled by the attorney, there was virtually nothing left of his life's work. She handed me a small, decorative silver pocket watch that had belonged to Grandpa Arthur, telling me that he had wanted me to have it as a keepsake. She handed Tyler a gold-plated ring that had belonged to my grandmother, telling him that Grandpa had wanted him to have something of high material value. I looked at the silver pocket watch, felt a deep sense of sadness for the end of an era, and accepted her story without a single shred of suspicion. I was 22 years old, grieving my grandfather, focused on trying to excel at my new job, and completely blind to the possibility that my own mother would lie to me about something so sacred. I held no bitterness about the lack of money because I had never expected an inheritance in the first place. I believed in earning my own way, just as Grandpa Arthur had taught me. Over the next 3 years, my life moved forward in a quiet, productive direction. I worked hard at my firm, earning 2 consecutive promotions through sheer reliability and a meticulous attention to detail that impressed my department directors. I rented a modest, clean apartment near the James River, managed my budget tightly, saved money every month, and met Sarah, a wonderful high school mathematics teacher who shared my values of honesty, practical living, and emotional stability. While my life was defined by steady, quiet progress, my mother and brother were living in a chaotic cycle of self-inflicted financial emergencies. Tyler moved through a series of increasingly absurd business ideas, each more expensive and short-lived than the last. He tried running a custom automotive wrap business, a day-trading educational channel, and a high-end luxury vehicle rental agency. Every single one of these ventures followed the exact same pattern: a massive initial outlay of cash for high-end equipment and flashy marketing, zero actual operational discipline, an accumulation of debt, and a sudden, silent collapse. Yet despite having no visible, legitimate source of steady income, Tyler moved into a high-end luxury apartment complex in downtown Richmond, leased a brand-new German sports car, and filled his social media feeds with photos of expensive dinners and weekend trips to Miami and Las Vegas. Whenever I visited my mother for holiday dinners, I noticed strange inconsistencies that I initially brushed aside as none of my business. My mother, who worked as an administrative assistant at a local dentist's office, earning $45,000 a year, suddenly paid off the remaining balance on her residential mortgage. She completely remodeled her kitchen with quartz countertops and custom cabinetry, installed an in-ground swimming pool in her backyard, and bought a top-tier SUV. When I asked her casually how she was managing these major home improvements on her salary, she brushed off the question with a wave of her hand, claiming she had made smart investments with her small life insurance payout from my father's death years ago. I did not press the issue because I had no desire to manage her personal finances or pry into her affairs. I was focused entirely on my own future, saving every spare dollar so that Sarah and I could eventually buy a house together. The turning point that shattered everything came 2.5 years ago, when Sarah and I finally found a beautiful, solid 4-bedroom brick house on a quiet quarter-acre lot in Henrico County. We put in an offer, had it accepted, and began the formal mortgage application process through a regional bank where I maintained my primary checking and savings accounts. Because I was meticulous about my credit, I gathered every single tax return, W-2 statement, pay stub, and bank statement from the previous 5 years, and submitted them to our dedicated mortgage loan officer, a thorough woman named Patricia. Everything was moving along smoothly toward a quick close until I received an urgent, unexpected phone call from Patricia on a Thursday afternoon while I was at my desk at work. Her voice was cautious, professional, and slightly confused as she asked if I had a moment to address a discrepancy that had surfaced during the underwriter's deep tax and asset audit. I stepped out of the open office environment and walked into an empty conference room, assuming there was a missing pay stub or a minor clerical error on my application. Patricia explained that, while running a comprehensive historical verification of my tax records through the automated system, the underwriter had flagged an IRS Schedule K-1 form linked directly to my Social Security number from 3 tax years prior. She stated that the document indicated a capital distribution of $142,500 from a trust entity identified as the Arthur E. Miller Testamentary Irrevocable Trust. She explained that the underwriters needed documentation showing where those funds were currently deposited or proof of how they had been liquidized, as the massive unrecorded transfer created a major discrepancy in my asset history. I stood in that empty conference room with my phone pressed against my ear, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. I told Patricia that there had to be a mistake, because I had never received a single dollar from any trust, nor had I ever signed tax documents acknowledging a six-figure distribution from my grandfather's estate. Patricia was silent for a long moment before telling me that the IRS records clearly showed the Schedule K-1 had been processed using my legal name, my social security number, and my home address at the time. She strongly advised me to contact the probate clerk's office in the county where my grandfather had resided and pull the complete public file for his estate before our loan application hit a hard stop in underwriting. I left work early that afternoon, my mind spinning in complete confusion. I drove directly to the Chesterfield County Circuit Court building, walked past the security checkpoints, and made my way down to the archives room in the probate division. I handed the clerk behind the desk my grandfather's full legal name, his date of death, and his social security number, paying the standard fee for a full certified copy of his estate file. 10 minutes later, the clerk returned with a thick manila folder stamped with the county court seal and handed it to me. I took the folder to a small wooden research table in the corner of the silent archives room, sat down, and opened the cover. As I turned through the pages, the terrible, undeniable truth began to reveal itself line by line. My grandfather had not died with massive medical debts. His medical bills had been fully covered by his comprehensive Medicare policy and a supplemental private insurance plan he had quietly paid into for 30 years. His house and workshop property had not been sold at a loss to pay off creditors. They had been sold to a local commercial buyer for $310,000, cash 6 months after his death. Most importantly, my grandfather's actual last will and testament, drafted 6 months before his passing, contained a clear, explicit provision that my mother had completely hidden from me. The will stipulated that after all minor administrative expenses were cleared, the entire net proceeds of his property sale and his $400,000 life insurance policy were to be split into 2 equal parts. One half was given directly to my mother as his surviving daughter-in-law's household representative. The second half, totaling precisely $285,000, was ordered to be divided equally between his 2 grandsons, Tyler and me, to be held in an irrevocable trust until each of us reached our 25th birthdays. My designated share was exactly $142,500. The trust document explicitly stated that these funds were intended to ensure that both of his grandsons had the foundation to buy a home, start a business, or secure their financial futures without debt. My eyes scanned down to the court distribution receipts and bank transaction records attached to the probate file. Because I was 22 when my grandfather died, the court required a designated adult custodian to oversee the trust account until I reached the age of 25. My mother had petitioned the probate court to act as the sole trustee and custodian of my account. 3 weeks after the court granted her trustee status, she took the court paperwork to a local branch of Chase Bank, where I had opened a joint student checking account with her when I was 17 years old to deposit my high school hardware store paychecks. Because my name was still technically linked to that old, dormant joint account from my teenage years, my mother was able to process the trust liquidation check directly into that account without my physical presence or knowledge. Within 48 hours of the trust funds hitting that joint account, she executed a series of wire transfers that completely drained the entire $142,500. The attached bank records, which my attorney would later obtain through formal discovery requests, showed exactly where every single dollar of my inheritance had gone. $80,000 had been transferred directly into a corporate account created by Tyler for his failed automotive business. $35,000 had been wired directly to a high-interest auto financing lender to pay off the remaining balance on Tyler's luxury vehicle. The remaining $27,500 had been transferred into my mother's personal checking account, where she used it to pay off her credit card balances and place a deposit on her custom kitchen remodeling project. To make matters infinitely worse, when tax season rolled around 2 years later, the year I turned 25, my mother had filled out the IRS Schedule K-1 forms, forged my signature on the tax acknowledgement documents, and filed them with the state and federal tax authorities to close out the trust's tax obligations. She had literally used my identity to clear the trust's legal existence, leaving me on the hook for the reported capital distribution, while she and Tyler spent every single cent of the money My grandfather had spent his entire life working to leave for me. I sat at that wooden table in the quiet basement of the county courthouse for over an hour, looking at my grandfather's real signature on the will next to my mother's forged signature on the distribution transfers. I felt a cold, hollow numbness spread through my chest. It was not just the money. The $142,000 was a life-changing sum for a young man trying to build a future from scratch. It was the absolute, calculated betrayal by the person who was supposed to protect me. She had sat across from me at her dining room table 5 years prior, looked me in the eye while I was grieving my grandfather, handed me a $50 silver watch, and told me there was nothing left. She had allowed me to work 60 hours a week, live on strict budgets, skip vacations, and worry about every dollar. While she and Tyler lived in luxury off the money, my grandfather had explicitly meant for my foundation. I did not drive to her house in a rage. I did not send frantic text messages or call her screaming. I remembered what Grandpa Arthur had taught me in his workshop. When you are faced with a massive problem, you do not react with emotion. You gather your data, examine the structural facts, and build a quiet, solid plan to address it. I left the courthouse with certified copies of every single document in the estate file. The next morning, I took a day of personal leave from my job and met with an experienced estate litigation and financial fraud attorney in downtown Richmond named Marcus. Marcus sat in his high-rise office, reviewed the probate filings, the bank transfer records, and the forged tax acknowledgments, and shook his head in quiet disbelief. He informed me that my mother had committed clear, unambiguous financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty as a court-appointed trustee, and identity theft regarding the forged tax forms. He explained that I had two distinct options moving forward. Option 1 was to file a formal criminal complaint with the Chesterfield County Commonwealth's attorney and the local sheriff's department, which would inevitably result in felony charges against my mother and potentially Tyler as an accessory to fraud. Option 2 was to draft a formal legal demand letter, attach the certified evidence, and serve her with a civil lawsuit notice that gave her 30 days to sign a legally binding confession of judgment and a promissory note secured by a lien against her home equity to repay the full principal sum plus interest. Marcus made it clear that option 2 would protect her from immediate arrest, while ensuring that I had a rock-solid, court-enforceable security interest that would legally guarantee I recovered every dollar she had stolen, whether through monthly structured repayments or upon the ultimate sale or refinance of her real estate. I looked out the window of Marcus's office at the Richmond skyline, thinking about my father, about Grandpa Arthur, and about the kind of man I wanted to be. I told Marcus to draft the formal demand package and prepare the civil suit filings. I decided that I would give her one chance to meet me face-to-face, look at the evidence, and sign the repayment agreement before we filed the paperwork with the court clerk. 2 days later, on an overcast Sunday afternoon, I drove to my mother's home in Chesterfield County. I carried a thick black 3-ring binder containing every certified court document, bank statement, wire transfer record, and handwriting comparison sample Marcus had assembled. My mother opened the front door with a light smile, assuming I was stopping by for a routine, casual visit. She invited me into the kitchen, pointing proudly to the newly installed quartz counter space and stainless steel appliances that had been purchased with my stolen trust money. I sat down at the kitchen island, opened the black binder, and slid the organized sections across the stone surface toward her without saying a word. She picked up the top document, glancing at the court headers with a confused, slightly annoyed expression. As her eyes moved down the page and saw the Chase Bank transfer records detailing the $80,000 wire to Tyler's account and her forged signature on the Schedule K-1 tax form, the color completely drained from her face. For 10 long seconds, the kitchen was dead silent. Then the transformation happened. She did not burst into tears, ask for forgiveness, or express a single drop of remorse. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of pure defensive fury. She slammed the binder shut, stood up from her stool, and began screaming at me with a venom I had never experienced in my life. She accused me of spying on my own family, hiring lawyers to attack my own mother, and digging through old garbage to ruin the peace of our home. She shouted that family money belonged to the family, that she had spent decades raising me, and that she had every moral right to distribute Grandpa Arthur's wealth where it was needed most. She shrieked that Tyler was struggling to make something of himself while I was doing fine with my corporate job, and that I was a cold, heartless, greedy monster for begrudging my own brother a helping hand. She told me that Grandpa Arthur would have been disgusted by my selfishness, claiming he would have wanted his money used to keep Tyler out of financial ruin. I sat on that barstool completely still, watching her scream and gesticulate in the kitchen she had bought with my stolen inheritance. Her words did not hurt me, because in that moment, the last lingering thread of childhood illusion completely snapped. I saw her clearly for the first time in my life. A deeply narcissistic, manipulative woman who viewed her eldest son as a utility to be exploited and her youngest son as an extension of her own fragile ego. When she finally ran out of breath and stood leaning against her new stone countertops, trembling with rage, I spoke in a quiet, conversational tone. I told her that I had not come to argue about morals, ethics, or family loyalty. I told her that the documents in that binder were certified copies of court and bank records that proved she had committed felony financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. I informed her that my attorney had already drafted the civil suit and the criminal fraud referral. I pointed to the legal settlement agreement sitting on the top of the binder, which required her to execute a formal deed of trust against her home equity in the amount of $142,500, with a structured monthly repayment schedule to reimburse my trust account. I told her she had precisely 7 days to sign the agreement in the presence of a notary public and return it to Marcus's law office, or the civil lawsuit and criminal complaint would be filed simultaneously with the county clerk and the Commonwealth's attorney on Monday morning. Her reaction was instant and absolute. She picked up the binder, threw it at my chest, and screamed at me to get out of her house. She told me that I was no longer her son, that she was cutting me out of her life forever, and that she would ensure every single member of our extended family knew that I was a cold, ungrateful monster who had tried to put his own mother in prison for money. I picked up the binder from the floor, walked out the front door, drove back to my apartment, and called Marcus to proceed with the legal filings. Over the next 48 hours, my mother launched a scorched earth propaganda campaign across our extended family network. My phone began buzzing relentlessly with text messages and voicemail recordings from my aunts, my uncles, and my cousins from all across Virginia and North Carolina. They accused me of being an ungrateful, money-obsessed sociopath who was suing his grieving, widowed mother over administrative technicalities from Grandpa's estate. They told me that family supports family, that Tyler was trying his best, and that I ought to be ashamed of myself for letting lawyers get involved in private household matters. Not a single one of those relatives asked to see the paperwork. Not a single one of them asked for my side of the story. They simply accepted my mother's tearful narrative because it was easier to attack the quiet, successful son than to confront the deep corruption sitting in the middle of their family. I did not respond to a single text message. I did not post a single defensive statement on social media. I did not pick up the phone to argue with my aunts or attempt to defend my character. I simply blocked the phone numbers of every relative who sent me abusive messages, handed all communications over to Marcus, and allowed the legal system to do its job in absolute silence. Faced with the legal reality of an impending public trial, a recorded lis pendens on her property title that blocked her from taking out further loans, and the undeniable paper trail assembled by my attorney, my mother ultimately hired a local defense attorney, who advised her to sign the civil settlement agreement to avoid public indictment and catastrophic legal costs. She executed the deed of trust, securing my $142,500 against her home equity, and agreed to a court-ordered repayment plan that required her to pay me $700 a month, while guaranteeing that the full remaining principal balance would be paid immediately upon any sale, transfer, or refinancing of her real estate. Once the legal papers were signed and filed with the Chesterfield County Land Records Office, my mother completely cut off all communication with me. She blocked my phone number, removed me from family photo sharing accounts, and instructed Tyler and the rest of the extended family to treat me as if I had ceased to exist. For 2 full years, there was absolute silence. During those 2 years, my life blossomed in ways I could have never imagined. Sarah and I closed on our house in Henrico County, using our own hard-earned savings for the down payment while holding the secured legal lien as a quiet, protected safety net for our future. We got married in a small, intimate courthouse ceremony surrounded by our closest friends, Sarah's loving family, and people who truly valued honesty and integrity. We spent our weekends working in our yard, building raised garden beds, painting rooms, and building a quiet, peaceful life rooted in stability and mutual respect. I excelled at my company, taking on a senior managerial role in operations and logistics. I never spent a single second missing the drama, the manipulation, or the constant financial fires that had defined my childhood. Meanwhile, behind the wall of silence, the natural consequences of my mother and Tyler's uncorrected behavior were playing out exactly as basic arithmetic and reality dictated they would. Without my stolen inheritance money available to cover his endless blunders, Tyler's financial life unraveled at an accelerated pace. He continued taking out high-interest private personal loans, opening credit cards under false revenue claims for his non-existent businesses, and failing to pay state and federal tax withholdings. My mother, driven by her pathological need to protect Tyler from the real world, used every spare dollar of her modest salary to pay off his short-term creditors. She defaulted on her own personal credit cards, maxed out her line of credit, and reached the absolute limit of what her income could support. When private lenders began threatening Tyler with civil judgments and asset seizures 6 months ago, my mother attempted to take out a second mortgage on her home to bail him out once again. However, when the title company ran a mandatory search on her property records, they immediately hit the legal deed of trust that Marcus had registered against her property 2 years prior. The bank refused to issue her a single dollar of new credit unless my senior lien was paid off in full first. She was trapped in a financial corner of her own making, unable to use her house as an endless piggy bank for Tyler's chaotic life. That brings us back to that warm Tuesday evening on my back deck in Henrico County, when her unblocked number appeared on my phone screen after 700 days of complete silence. When she called demanding $75,000 to cover Tyler's immediate debt crisis, she was not calling as a mother seeking reconciliation. She was calling as a desperate gambler who had run out of chips, realizing that the only person left in the world with actual financial security was the son she had stolen from, lied about, and discarded 2 years ago. When I told her to pay Tyler's debts with the $140,000 she had secretly stolen from my grandfather's inheritance and hung up the phone, I thought that would be the end of it. I underestimated the absolute delusion of people who believe they are entitled to other people's labor. 10 minutes after I hung up on my mother, my phone began vibrating continuously on the wooden side table. My aunts, my uncles, and my cousins, the very same flying monkeys who had shunned me 2 years ago, began firing off a coordinated barrage of text messages, voicemails, and group chat invitations. My Aunt Karen sent a lengthy text message declaring that I was an absolute disgrace to the family name, stating that Tyler was facing active legal action from loan companies, and asserting that a true brother would never sit on savings while his family suffered. My Uncle Robert left a furious 3-minute voicemail, stating that whatever happened with Grandpa's estate in the past was water under the bridge, and that refusing to help my mother and brother now proved that I was a cold, vengeful monster who cared more about money than blood. They were operating under the exact same false narrative my mother had fed them 2 years ago, that I had thrown a selfish temper tantrum over minor estate paperwork, held a bitter grudge, and was now withholding aid out of pure spite. I sat at my kitchen counter with a hot cup of coffee, looking at the flood of abusive text messages pouring into my phone. 2 years ago, I had chosen silence and allowed them to believe her lies because I did not care to defend myself to people who did not matter to my daily life. On this night, however, I realized that allowing her false narrative to persist was allowing her to continue manipulating the entire extended family while playing the innocent victim. I decided it was time to let the undisputed facts do the talking once and for all. I opened my laptop, logged into my secure cloud storage, and accessed the master legal file that Marcus had compiled for our court settlement. I created a single, beautifully organized, high-resolution PDF document titled Formal Estate Accounting and Settlement Summary. On page 1, I placed a clear scan of my grandfather Arthur's original, probated last will and testament, highlighting the specific clause where he designated $142,500 explicitly for my 25th birthday to buy a home. On page 2, I included the certified bank transaction logs showing my mother establishing the joint account, forging my signature on transfer forms, and executing the immediate wire transfers to Tyler's corporate accounts and auto lenders. On page 3, I included the IRS Schedule K-1 tax filings, where she had forged my signature to clear the trust's tax liability while hiding the payout from me. On page 4, I included a copy of the formal Chesterfield County land records showing the legally binding deed of trust and confession of judgment she had been forced to sign to avoid criminal fraud prosecution. On page 5, I wrote a brief, 3-sentence cover message in completely calm, neutral language. I stated that I was providing this complete legal record so that everyone in the family had full visibility into the actual events of the past 5 years. I explained that my mother had already taken 6 figures of my personal inheritance without my knowledge or consent to fund Tyler's lifestyle, and that my boundary was absolute. I concluded by stating that anyone who wished to contribute their own personal funds to pay off Tyler's debts was entirely welcome to do so, but that no further inquiry regarding my finances would be acknowledged. I attached the PDF file to a single master email, added the email addresses of every single aunt, uncle, cousin, and family member who had texted or called me over the past 48 hours, and hit send. The effect was immediate, absolute, and profoundly satisfying. Within 15 minutes of that email hitting their inboxes, the flood of angry text messages and furious voicemails stopped dead in its tracks. The silent, undeniable weight of official court documents, bank wire receipts, and forged signature records wiped out 2 years of my mother's elaborate lies in a matter of minutes. Over the next 48 hours, the quiet fallout began to unfold across the family network. My Aunt Karen called my phone twice, leaving a hesitant, deeply uncomfortable voicemail in which she did not explicitly apologize, but admitted that she had never been shown those documents and had no idea that my mother had taken my trust money or forged legal papers. My Uncle Robert sent a brief text message stating that he was deeply sorry for his previous voicemail, acknowledging that he had been completely misled about the nature of our legal dispute. 2 of my cousins sent private messages expressing absolute shock at the paper trail, apologizing for having taken my mother's side without ever checking the facts. Not a single family member offered to lend Tyler the $75,000 he needed. Once they realized that my mother had already burned through 6 figures of stolen trust money on his failed ventures without any accountability, none of them were willing to risk their own hard-earned savings to bail him out. With no one left to exploit, no legal leverage to borrow against her house, and no family members willing to fund their endless debt cycle, my mother and Tyler were forced to face the unvarnished reality of their own choices. 3 weeks after that phone call, Tyler filed for Chapter 7 personal bankruptcy in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. His leased luxury vehicle was surrendered to the financing company. His expensive apartment lease was terminated, and he was forced to liquidate his personal belongings to cover mandatory administrative court fees. He moved into a small, basic 1-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of the city and took an entry-level inventory shift job at a commercial distribution center. The exact kind of practical, hourly work he had spent his entire life looking down upon. My mother, facing mounting credit card interest, local real estate tax liabilities, and the reality that she could no longer maintain her suburban lifestyle on her single administrative salary, was forced to place her Chesterfield County home on the market. When the house was sold 2 months later, the closing attorney was legally mandated by the county land records to settle my senior deed of trust before my mother received a single dollar from the sale proceeds. At the formal real estate closing, my attorney received a certified cashier's check for the full remaining principal sum of my stolen inheritance, plus accrued court-ordered interest, totaling $146,800. The funds were deposited directly into my personal high-yield investment account, fully restoring the foundation my grandfather Arthur had worked so hard to build for me. After my legal lien was satisfied and her outstanding personal debts were cleared, my mother was left with a modest residual balance. She moved into a small, single-story rental unit in a quiet suburban retirement complex, living entirely within the boundaries of her actual monthly salary and modest savings. She no longer hosts lavish holiday dinners, no longer boasts about high-end home renovations, and no longer puts on a grand performance for the extended family. She and Tyler now live in quiet, practical reality, stripped of the illusions, forged signatures, and stolen money that had sustained their chaotic lifestyle for over a decade. I have not spoken to my mother or Tyler since the night I hung up the phone on my back deck, and I have no intention of ever restoring contact. Some relationships are not broken by simple misunderstandings that can be patched over with time or hollow apologies. They are broken by a fundamental lack of character, honesty, and basic human respect. My life today is defined by a deep, unwavering peace. Sarah and I used a small portion of the recovered inheritance funds to pay off our mortgage principal early, dropping our monthly living expenses to a fraction of what most people our age face. We spend our weekends hosting quiet dinners with Sarah's warm family, traveling to national parks, working on our home, and enjoying the absolute security that comes from quiet discipline and solid planning. Whenever I walk out into my garage workshop on a quiet weekend morning, pick up my grandfather's old precision micrometers, and feel the cold steel in my hands, I am reminded of the lessons he taught me on those long Saturdays in rural Chesterfield County. He taught me that real strength does not come from screaming, making demands, or trying to control how other people view you. Real strength comes from keeping your head down, working hard when nobody is watching, keeping immaculate records, standing firm in the truth, and allowing the facts to dismantle every lie in their own time. I didn't win because I sought revenge or tried to ruin my family. I won because I stayed calm, kept every document, refused to be manipulated, and let reality take its course. And as I sit on my back deck on warm Virginia evenings, listening to the quiet rustle of the oak trees and watching the sun set over a home that belongs entirely to my wife and me, I know that Grandpa Arthur would be proud of the man I became.